I won't have any images to show you, so bear with me. And I don't really know what it will have to do with the algorithm. I won't talk about algorithms either, but I will talk about the digital history of photography instead. And the hypothesis I intend to propose today belongs to what I would call an archaeology of scholarly disciplines and objects. The archaeologies of knowledge developed over the years in dialogue with Michel Foucault's work have made me curious about the scholarly object of photographic history, an object of scholarly knowledge which arguably appears to have changed over the past decades. To test my hypothesis, I have done some archival research, but this, I must admit, has not been extensive enough to either prove or disprove what I'm about to propose. Further excavation and analysis are required to assess the proposition that I will put forward. Now, as we have seen yesterday and this morning, digital photography and indeed digital image culture continues to pose scholarly challenges to researchers of photography. One of these challenges, which we perhaps have not explicitly dealt with yet, concerns the object of photographic history. This object is perhaps not simply photographic images and practices of the past. It is rather what scholars of photography, academic, artistic, or otherwise, engage with, what they argue about, and find relevant to understand. It seems this object has undergone significant changes in the past couple of decades or so. I will suggest that the historical object that today's scholars of photography perceive and conceive has mutated very dramatically over the past 15 or 20 years. It is this change that I will try and focus on for the next 25 minutes or so. What exactly is it that has ostensibly changed, and from what and into what has it changed, and why, due to what processes has this change come to pass? The historical object is what we engage with when, with scholarly techniques and institutional backing, we address historically the object of photography. This object contains many different things, of course, but it does not include any old thing. The things that belong to the history of photography belong to it insofar as they answer to the institutionally recognized way of producing historical knowledge. These are the things that historians call historical objects. They are what historians produce knowledge about. Historical objects are what they are insofar as we engage with and produce knowledge about them. As we don't engage with certain objects of the past, for instance, we don't engage with things that are undiscovered or considered irrelevant, these are thus not historical objects. It was Aristotle who said that to each science belongs its particular object, and that this object is what defines that particular science. As a scientist, one must not, according to Aristotle, confuse one's object with that of another science, because any pursuit of knowledge must be guided by what it seeks knowledge about. And as objects are different, each with their distinct nature, knowledge seekers must follow and respect these distinctions. What Aristotle remained foreign to, and left to modern historians of science to grapple with, is the fact that sciences and their objects tend to develop, mutate, prosper, and sometimes die. Today I intend to consider the mutability of objects that belong to the historical sciences, whether these objects are photographic images, practices, technologies, photographers, clients, distribution routes, contracts, documents, letters, archives, or other. I spoke just now without distinction of, on the one hand, a scholarly object in the singular sense, and on the other, of objects in the plural. Allow me to clarify. Obviously, there are scholarly objects like the ones just mentioned, images, practices, and so on. Objects that scholars of photography research and interpret, but one may also speak about as a scholarly object in the singular sense, as what pertains to a given discipline, however multifaceted it may be. This singular object is not simply the sum total of all objects being investigated. It would imply analog changes in both categories and hence be a rather meaningless concept. It is rather a more abstract thing, something like the domain of interest that a scholarly discipline orients itself toward. Within such a given domain, new objects may be found, meanings may be disputed, new scholars may take part, and institutions may come and go without the domain itself necessarily changing. But occasionally, for various reasons, domains do change as a whole. The relations that constitute them reorganize. A domain may even change while scholars believe they are speaking of the same things as before. But then they have actually begun to speak about them in such a way that the things are in fact no longer quite the same. It is very difficult for scholars to notice these changes while they occur. It is as if the research community develops along its natural course, and then suddenly is it possible to look back and recognize that the straight and narrow was in fact a sharp turn. Another predicament is that history proper and historical objects are produced and defined within the scholarly domain. History is conditioned by the domain's structure. A history of domains would be a history of that which conditions history. As for example, Walter Benjamin, Alexander Coiré, and Michel Foucault have shown, each in very different ways, this meta-history requires far more speculative approaches than what conventional history affords, hence the term archaeology. Now, if one endeavors today to look back at where or at what the history of photography was in, let's say, the early 90s, it was certainly very different from today. Indeed, we seem no longer to be dealing with the same domain anymore. Our discipline's interests have changed, and today we find other disputes to engage in. Therefore, I dare to hypothesize that the object of the history of photography is indeed changed. One important transformation is the declining interest in contesting the grand history of photography. It seems today that the contestants have left the arena. No one either pursues the traditional category of history or publish vigorous arguments for alternative approaches. I may be mistaken, but it seems to me that the last monograph to present the grand history of photography was a 1999 publication from the George Eastman House collection titled A History of Photography from 1839 to the Present, confusingly similar to the well-known Beaumont-Newhall 1955 title, The History of Photography from 1839 to the Present. Now, even though both works are indeed penned as traditional grand histories, the minor difference in their titles, A History versus The History, reflects a dispute that rose to significance in the late 70s and 80s. A history may signify one history among many, whereas the history suggests a singular, unique, true history. History, or rather historiography, intimating the politics of writing history, was for decades a contested area of our domain, one of our discipline's great interests. We do recall the apposite title of Richard Bolton's collection of critical essays from 1989, Contest of Meanings, Critical Histories of Photography. We recall perhaps also the editor's thundering call in his introduction for a social history of photography, a multitudinous one capable of elucidating the politics of meaning. Featuring seminal essays by Sally Stein, Carol Squires, Martha Rosler, Rosalind Krauss, and others, this contribution voiced deep scholarly dissatisfaction with the univocal perspective on history. However, the George Eastman House title from 10 years later, emphasizing a history on photography, is, in spite of its title, certainly not presuming one history among many. In most respects, it follows the traditional monumental history, while it seems paying mere lip service to a strong critical tradition. This book may be considered as a token of a developing compromise, indeed as the beginning of the end of a dispute which was very much alive also within historical volumes of the 80s and 90s, such as Ian Jeffreys' 1981 Photography, A Concise History, or in the Coffee Table Overview, A World History of Photography a few years later, with its due emphasis on non-Western photography and distinct social practices, but still within a uniform historical perspective. Most so in Michel Frisot's Nouvelle Histoire de la Photographie from 1994, to be translated 5 years later into A New History of Photography. In the mid-90s, Frisot still needed to take a stand against the tradition of grand history. This book, he wrote, and I quote, is not an anthology of the lives of the best photographers, nor a collection of the best contemporary photographs, nor a sounding board for recognized celebrities, end quote. At the time, this needed to be said in contradistinction to the still strong historicist tradition as voiced, for example, by Colin Osman, founder of Creative Camera, who in 1990 could begin a historical article about Antonioni Beato with the following truism, quote, "The history of photography is made up of the lives of countless photographers who are virtually without history. It is a darkness illuminated by occasional beams of light." End quote. Frisot's counter-historicist perspective sought rather to trace the paradoxical and ambiguous nature of photographic images. Quote, "Their centrifugal dynamic rather than their classification into categories," end quote. Showing awareness not only of photography's multiple and mutating genres, functions, and social-cultural practices, he also explicitly highlights the circumstance that the historical illustrations presents not photographs in the strict sense, but photomechanical reproductions of photographs, thus merely representing the object of historical treatment. The historical object of photography was never as elusive as in this tome. Its history is never as plurivocal as here, never as intertwined and unruly. At this moment, the historical object has irreversibly begun to change. The inflection of the curve has been reached. The contestants of historiography begin to pack up and leave for other battlefields. What seems clear enough already in Liz Wells' Photography, A Critical Introduction from 1997. In answer to her introduction's subheading, which is called Debates Historically and Now, the first one to be presented, apparently as a dispute overdue, is the debate on historical construction. It was perhaps up to Geoffrey Batchen's burning with desire to definitely turn off the lights in 2001 and lock up. What happened next? For the next decade or so, historiography would not present much of a contested subject. Critical discourse moved to other terrains, found other objects, and strictly historical contributions have since dutifully, if not wholeheartedly, taken into account the plurality of photographic image practices and their complex social and political histories. Recent semi-monumental histories, such as Todd Gustafson's Camera, A History of Photography from Daguerre to Digital from 2008, do not resemble the Newhall and the Sharkovsky monographs, but neither do they follow the critical agendas outlined in, for example, Contested Meaning or in John Tagg's The Burden of Representation. They represent something of a humbled historicist account, an informative summary of a camera's evolutionary progression, rather than an ambitious academic presentation of historical development. Today, in the absence of scholarly contestants over history, our discipline no longer pursues the critique of historicism, and so our scholarly object in the singular sense, our scholarly domain, is no longer what it once was. Not that historicism as such is dead, it still persists, perhaps modified, but nonetheless as a preferred mainstream form of history writing. Why, then, if not because of victory, has the once so vigorous critique settled with a compromise? There are perhaps at least two answers, one having to do with the power of photography as a theoretical metaphor. Photography was namely once called upon as a model for thinking otherwise by pioneers in the philosophical critique against historicism. It inspired writers like Nietzsche, Freud, Adorno, and most of all Walter Benjamin, for it held keys to escape the straitjacket of progress and its correlate in historicism. Photographs seemed to present the world in images with an untimeliness that was irreducible to historicism. This has to do with what Daniel spoke of yesterday as the latency of images. Certain historians of concepts, such as Sarah Kaufman, Eduardo Cadava, George Didi Huberman, Giorgio Agamben, and Mika Elo, have examined this metaphor in philosophy, and I have recently joined their ranks with a book on photography as the art of reconciliation that grounds modern dialectical thought. Chemical, or analog photography as we say today, promised once upon a time a grounding and a groundbreaking critique of progress because of the deferral implied in the image-making process. The fact that the chemical image needs time to become visible means that its represented past has never been present to itself. Hence, the image refuses the idea of a past, quote, as it really was, to paraphrase Benjamin. Digital photography, however, does not evoke similar notions. Chimping is the word, I believe, for what photographers do when they immediately after a shot consult the camera's back screen for a glance at the result. To a chimp, the camera presents an image in real time. Not even Polaroid could ever deliver that immediacy. But this technological advance means at the same time reduced possibilities for photography to model a critique against as it really was. Nothing about digital photography seems to resist historicism. Now, the critical metaphor of deferral that was extracted from analog photography at the turn of the century did not immediately lead contemporary scholars to a counter-historicist history of photography. The metaphor had to be processed by a philosophical tradition invested in cultural politics before it reached thus far. It took time to recognize the radical photographic concept of experience deferral, a concept in which time becomes historical and hence dependent on social modes of experience. Abigail Solomon Godot recognized it when she opened her introduction to photography at the dock with a quotation from Walter Benjamin, and I quote her quoting Benjamin, "The events surrounding the historian and in which he takes part will underlie his presentation like a text written in invisible ink." End all quotations. The early 20th century's preoccupation with deferred experience is, I believe, what showed up later to support the postmodern call for social and cultural histories in the 80s. It was this politico-theoretical demand that reshaped the historical object of photography and redefined our disciplinary domain. That this critical enterprise came to a close in the late 90s is not, of course, because digital photographs failed to produce the analog's deferral of experience. Nor is it because the internet arrived around the same time. But on the other hand, although the event was rather brought about by political dissatisfaction and with the aid of advanced theoretical propositions and arguments, it is nonetheless true that the growing use of digital cameras and image processing tools, not to mention the increasing use of online dissemination networks and new functions related to a burgeoning digital image industry, made sure that the socio-political interest eventually settled for a more apposite object than history, capital H history. The first answer to why the fierce critique ended with a compromise is probably that, as it were, the point had been proven and that historical practice had taken notice. By the mid-90s, enough had been said, loud and clear, to make a return to old-fashioned historicism impossible. I've rummaged through 2 decades of back issues of the journals History of Photography and Fotogeschichte to substantiate this claim. The second answer may require a more detailed question. For why, and at which point, did the digital networks and image sharing sites, the mobile phone camera, the practices associated with it, the military, security, and police imaging policies, and the digital heritage and archive issues become more relevant to research than the historical development of photography. Firstly, it is not true that photo history disappeared or came to an end in the late 90s. The historical object of photographic research transformed, but it lived on and is still alive in mutated form. In fact, a greater number of historical articles and monographs are being published today than ever before. But while the narrative has changed, either into something of a less ambitious version of historicism or into a multitude of various edited perspectives of a given historical theme, event, or circumstance, which I believe could be exemplified by Darren's presentation this morning, it remains that the historical object is in no sense as contested today as it was a few decades ago. In that sense, is it less relevant than the digital object. So back to the question, at which point and why did the practices of digital photography appear more relevant, more contestable as a scholarly object than the historical development of photography? It's difficult to say, and even if photography after photography from 1996 is a much cited reference point, there were many contributions, both earlier and later, that could just as easily be quoted. Looking not for a given point in time, however, but for a curve of shifting interest, one might suggest that the shift begins around the later half of the 90s, but manifests itself as a steady curvature and a new direction only a decade later. That which attracted enough research interest to complete this slow shift in epistemic direction and the new scholarly domain are perhaps two things that intertwine. One, I believe, is due to a perceived formal congruence between, on the one hand, postmodernity's political ideal of multitudinous coexisting cultural ideologies and, on the other, certain characteristics of life online. In the freedom to construct personal online identities, Mark Poster and N. Catherine Hales quickly saw a revolutionary political grassroots power. This idea of avataric freedom was later criticized in a bulk of research papers that pointed out the stereotypes modeling the constructing agenda. But nonetheless, the formal congruence between developing online practices and postmodern idealism attracted sociological attention to the network of digital images. These now circulated in an immanent cybernetic world, perhaps best outlined by Emmanuel Castell's The Network Society, Boltanski and Chiapello's The New Spirit of Capitalism, Negri and Hart's Empire, or in accordance with Bruno Latour's actor network theory, not to mention Deleuze. This is a world of connected, yet autonomous agents organizing, differentiating, and regulating temporary units and communities in territorial on- and offline public market spheres, running on immanent feedback and self-structuring processes, where a former transcendental state apparatus has been replaced by corporate platforms that can no longer be identified as a macro-social opponent. Because the formal congruence between digital and social networks implied a new order of political governing, one with refined and challenging methods of social dominance, the life of digital images evolved quickly into a highly relevant and contestable object for a socially invested scholarship. A compromise with historicism seemed, from this perspective, perhaps to be sufficient. At stake was something more politically relevant. The second very powerful attractor that drew scholarly research to digital photography was, I believe, in a more cynical way, prospects of academic growth. One should keep in mind that during the second half of the 90s and early 2000s, no one knew to what extent digital photography would replace analog photography. Scholars did not turn to digital imagery because everybody knew that analog photography would be gone in 10 years. However, most felt certain that digital photography would stay on and develop. The field of research was therefore certain to grow. New phenomena were relevant to investigate, and in the days of general economic prosperity, there were ample opportunities within the universities to expand, to develop, and to forge new academic alliances. For example, with media studies, with visual anthropology, with political sciences, sociology, with comparative literature. Cross-disciplinary visual culture was the name of the day. This optimism sparked a number of academic initiatives. New peer-reviewed journals devoted to photography appeared alongside university programs and research centers, not to mention transdisciplinary network projects, cross-cultural collaborations, joint PhD programs, photography educational programs, etc. This came about as people in the field consciously recognized an opportunity to expand their field of scholarly interest. And the digital domain appeared certainly very more promising in this respect than the analog. So, to conclude, a new political challenge and a promise of future academic growth seems to have attracted research attention to digital photography over a period between, say, 1995 to 2005, turning the discipline's domain in a direction of increasingly sociological objects. Furthermore, the postmodern critique of historicism actually managed to prove, with the aid of a metaphor culled from the historical object itself, the social and historical construction of historicism. The battle with historicism settled with a compromise. An academically weak, mere informative version of historicism was allowed to prevail alongside a stronger historical object in different form. This object underpinned a multitudinous, perspectival, even fragmented form of historical knowledge. It is typically pursued in the form of historical contextualizations of past photographic events or series of events, more often than not related to political or social turbulence. The scholarly object of historical research in photography has indeed shifted during the past 2 decades, perhaps under our radar, but not in a more dramatic way than it has shifted at other times. For periodical reorientations of a discipline's scholarly object seem rather to be the norm than the exception, occasionally with enough force to bury the old object and discipline as such. As this has not happened yet, we may just be about to discover the historical precursor to digital photography, one that is quite different to what it was not that long ago. Thank you.